Hey everybody, today I'm going to sit down with Shark Tank star Matt Higgins to talk about diversification, debt, and real estate investing, and a few other things too. Before we dive in, please take a minute, click subscribe to my channel, and check out the link you see on your screen for a message from our sponsor, The Motley Fool. It's the best way to support this work we're doing on YouTube, and you can get the top 10 stocks to buy right now. I am talking today to Matt Higgins. He is CEO and co-founder of private investment firm RSE Ventures. He is a frequent guest on Shark Tank, and he's the author of the Wall Street Journal best-selling book, Burn the Boats. Matt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Also, a huge fan of Motley Fool ever since I was a little kid. Always, maybe not a little kid, but since I was young, always great the way you turn everything and make it accessible.
Excellent. And there's a lot of overlap, I think, between our styles, which I'm sure we'll get into in a little while. So I wanted to talk to you about some of these myths that you want to get rid of. If anyone has watched any financial news, financial talk shows, anything like that, like Dave Ramsey, you've probably heard the advice to stay out of debt. Get out of debt at all costs. Before you even invest, pay off your debt. Why don't you agree with this advice?
Yeah, I think honestly it's very clickbaity, very simplistic, and the simple reason is that all debt is not the same. Obviously, debt that you use to go ahead and acquire depreciating assets or indulgence, martinis or lattes or just junk. Of course, that's bad debt. But let's talk about housing in particular, right? Debt against real estate is one of the only ways that somebody just starting out can get leverage, right? Basically, bank is giving you that you have to put down X percentage to control that underlying asset. Real estate tends to appreciate over time around 4% historically, more in different areas. And so I just think telling people like all debt is bad, then they would say, well, I'm just going to rent for my whole life. And reality is I've made some very bad decisions on my way to Shark Tank, but I've never made a bad real estate decision. And when I look back at the way I accumulated initially a lot of wealth, it was by controlling real estate and making really good decisions. So I just think it's way too simplistic. And the other point about telling people all debt is bad, it doesn't make them dig into the details. If I had student loans for a very long time, way past the point that I could pay them back, you know why I kept my student loans? The interest rate was 2%. I could take that $5,000 that I might use to pay off my loan, and I could get a greater return than that interest rate. So what do you want to do when you're contemplating debt? Is this an appreciating asset? Am I going to be able to achieve a greater return than the amount of debt service? What's the opportunity cost of prepaying this particular debt versus going ahead and using that $5,000 and putting it into the S&P where historical returns are 7%? So I'll give you a quick example. At West Point, I didn't know this. I just went and spoke to the cadets there. They have a program. I'm going to make up the numbers, but they're somewhere approximate. I think in your third year, they will give you $35,000 of debt to use as you will at like a 2% interest rate. Which, by the way, we all know we could get almost a 5% return right now in money markets and whatnot. So, like, what would you tell the cadet then? Don't do it, or be really disciplined. Make sure you're putting it somewhere where you're going to lock up a better return than the interest rate, and then it becomes like a no-brainer. So the bottom line is, I think telling people all debt is bad is just simplistic clickbait.
So I'm really glad you brought up interest rates because I feel like I've been a real estate investor for a while. I know you've been a real estate investor for a while through a bunch of different interest rate environments. Buying real estate was much more of a no-brainer when you could borrow at 3 or 4% than it is today. Do you still kind of stick to that? Where is a mortgage still a good debt today? Is borrowing money to buy property still a good debt form of debt today? And how do you kind of stand on that?
Look, I think real estate over the course of time is always still a great investment. Obviously, we're in a very high interest rate environment, but you have to look at the other side of this, right? When interest rates go down, it's because the Fed is trying to stimulate the economy, right? And means we've gone through a rough patch. At some point, interest rates are going to come down. I still believe we're in for a reckoning, and I'm not in the soft landing crowd. But let's say you do lock in a property in an interest rate environment, high interest rate environment. Eventually, property prices do come down, and then when interest rates come down, you could refinance. So I think it's very hard to time the real estate market. I think the more important decision, this as being a real estate investor, is making sure that you're making a really smart decision as it pertains to that particular asset. Are you buying a piece of property where there's going to be a Whole Foods on the corner in 2.5 years, or where you could sort of see the signs that the area is turning and you're getting in a little bit early? I think the smarter the real estate decision you make, the more cushion you give yourself to be able to navigate through tough environments. And so, long way of saying, I still think even in a high interest rate environment, real estate does make sense because you'll be able to refinance down the road. And if you are able to refinance, that means rates came down, and that means money is pouring back into real estate again, because the lower the interest rate, the more a purchasing power somebody has, and the more they're going to reach for higher prices.
So I think it's fair to say the answer to my next question is yes, but I'll ask it anyway. Um, if you were starting today, would you think this is still a good environment to buy your first rental property in?
I would probably wait a little bit, to be honest. I would wait for prices to come down. I think that as soon as the market gets a bit unstuck, there's going to be a lot of inventory pushing into the market. Second of all, I think unemployment is going to tick higher. I don't think the Fed's war against inflation is over. I think there's a lot of hopium in the market right now, which always happens right up against the cusp of a correction or reckoning or a downturn. And so that's a long way of saying I think there's going to be more opportunities at better prices than there are right now. So again, they say don't time the market. I think you can time real estate a little bit. Very hard to time stocks because it's moving so quick. Hard to time Nvidia perfectly, but you can time your real estate purchases. And so, yes, rental property, great. I would wait to see prices come down and for unemployment to tick up, which I believe it is, which is going to create more selling pressure. So I don't think you're going to get it's the ideal time to get the right price right this second.
All right, so last question on real estate, and then we'll move on. Other than wait a little while, if someone wanted to get started investing today, what's the best advice you can give to someone who wants to start investing in real estate but doesn't really know where to begin?
Yeah, so let's assume we're talking about rental properties. I actually believe the Airbnb model will sort itself out again. I'm biased. I'm friendly with the founder. I think he's a great leader, Brian Chesky. So that's a long way of saying you want to look for real estate that is anchored by an institution that isn't going anywhere. So let's just say that you were interested in Airbnb and you wanted to make sure that you had constant throughput. Maybe you're looking at Ann Arbor, somewhere around University of Michigan, right? Like you're looking in places, or you have a specific thesis. You want to target traveling nurses because the reimbursement rates there are very favorable. I just think you need an idea, a thesis. I'm gonna go around this institution or this neighborhood I think is up and coming. Nashville's amazing. Two, you want to make sure that you are able to spend the time in one area and highly concentrate. I think when it pertains to real estate, I think understanding a geography is really important, and you don't want to diversify your energy and attention to multiple markets that you can't reach. I believe it doesn't have to be like down the block, but it has to be somewhere where you can reach and somewhere where you can really get to know the neighborhood and accumulate properties within that geography around an idea, a thesis, a theme.
I would echo the traveling nurses thing. We have a property that's occupied by traveling nurses right now. That's actually a really interesting submarket.
Isn't it? Well, so you know exactly what. Why don't you explain to the listener, why?
Well, traveling nurses generally are on shorter term contracts, and they get reimbursed by their hospital system. And the reimbursement rate, like you said, is great. And it's like lose it or use it money. So they tend to get a nice property, and it's a great way to get tenants in there for a moderately long term lease and kind of increase. It's like the best of both worlds: the best of a short term rental in terms of higher leasing rates and great tenants, and the best of a long term lease in terms of revenue predictability.
Exactly. And so to double click on that, I always believe when you're making an investment, especially around real estate, you want to have multiple ways you can win. So one way is because you're in an up and coming area, anchored to a particular institution, or targeting a demographic like traveling nurses, and you find a property that is needs rehabilitation. Nobody wants to do the work. Everybody's afraid of it. I happen to be married to a licensed contractor and an architect. So whenever I make a real estate decision, I always try to create a built-in return by doing the work. So if anyone out there is listening to me and you have somebody in your peer group, your friend group, or you, and you actually know how to do work, that's another way to the way. So these are all ways in which you can increase the cushion to protect you against the unforeseeable. Like, oh, the environment was wrong, I got this wrong, and you can grow into the decision. But the most important part of this conversation is real estate is one of the only ways that an ordinary person can get leverage, right? And it's recourse, and it's non-recourse. It's collateralized against the asset. So if all hell goes loose, you know what you're going to do. Thank you, bank. Here are the keys. So I just think when you tell folks, all debt's bad, now you're creating a whole new class of renters. And I just have a lot of friends. I'm now in my 40s that, but for buying that first property many years ago, they would have no wealth. And yet now at least they can sleep at night because we all know the rule of 72. If you're listening to this and you know what this means, you basically take the interest rate of something and divide it by 72, and that tells you the number of years it'll take to double. So let's say you bought a property when you're 30. It's most likely that by the time you're 45, that asset's going to double. And so I know a lot of people became a millionaire simply because they made good real estate decisions early on in their life.
Yeah, I know a lot of people in the same situation. I briefly wanted to touch on your thoughts on diversification, because one of my favorite Warren Buffett quotes of all time is diversification is protection from not knowing what you're doing. And you say that diversification, I'm paraphrasing here, but diversification is overrated. So one of the things that really stood out to me is that you say at any given time, 75% of your money is in, three stocks. So can you expand on why you think diversification is not what the average investor should look for?
Yeah, I think diversification is the enemy of wealth creation, honestly, and it's the friend of the lazy. And I know that defies conventional wisdom, and that's because it's an extrapolation from the fact that money managers usually underperform the S&P. So you look at that and you're like, wait, why am I paying that person, a percent on my wealth, and they're actually outperforming when I could have just bought, SPY, right? That's the wrong extrapolation. The right extrapolation from that data point is like, you suck and you're not putting in enough energy to actively manage my money. And then the question is, can I do it better? So why do I think diversification is the enemy of wealth creation? Because obviously the wider you go, the more likely it is to end up being an average return. Like, nobody can outperform across 50 positions. And so that's number one. Number two, the way to create wealth is to know something inside and out. You understand like real estate, right? You stay within a geography. I wouldn't tell you right now, let's diversify real estate by going into 10 markets. Like, not going to work. Same thing when it comes to equities. When you concentrate based upon an informed thesis, then you can read every single thing about it. There's a study coming out in 2 weeks. Oh, wait, I got to make sure that I understand what's going to be happening at that conference. And so when you concentrate, you get to use your brain power, your insight. And the good thing about the SEC and the regulations that were passed in the 30s, the information really is available to everyone. Like, this idea that you have an inside advantage if you're a professional money market's not true. If you put the time in, anybody can learn. So back to concentration. When you concentrate, then you can take that conviction and you could find different ways to play that idea. So let's look at NVIDIA. I have been overweight on NVIDIA for almost 2 years now. I've made a fortune on NVIDIA, and it's not just about being in the equity. I'm a big believer in options and derivatives, which is another thing that people will tell you, don't do that. It's bad or scary. Like, covered calls and selling puts. We don't have to get into it on here, but if you have a position that you have strong conviction in, that gives you the confidence to find different ways to monetize that conviction, right? So the other one, another big position of mine for a very long time has been Eli Lilly, because I did the research on GLP-1, what's likely to happen, what are the early studies saying, what are the consequences, and my mom died of obesity. So I'm very aware of the comorbid conditions that come from being obese and the extent to which these drugs are going to change the world. That made me find other ways, to profit from that thesis, whether it means betting against, like junk food or leaning all into it. So I'm just giving you those two illustrations that when you have an idea, a thesis, then you can heavily concentrate on it. And look, if things are going wrong or you're wrong, I don't say put all your eggs in one basket. I'm not in one position, but at any one time, I'm heavily concentrated in three. And here's the irony of it all: the other 25% always drags down the three. Always. Like, I can't seem to make a good decision outside the concentration. I think that's actually pretty common for everyone, right? Because I don't know enough about the other 20. I miss an angle, or I'm relying on someone else's opinion that doesn't go through my own filter. So, long story short, if you want to get wealth, and you look at the wealthiest people and how they got wealthy, they concentrated their conviction and they diluted their doubt, right? Whereas most people look to dilute their conviction by becoming diversified. You got to do the opposite. How do I strengthen my conviction? Through knowledge, information, insight, research, and then gut.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and it's kind of important to kind of emphasize that you're saying know what you're investing in as best you can. You can know three or four things really really well, and then incorporate, especially with options. You're not saying open your first investment account and YOLO into some options right now.
No. I'm saying to make that clear for those who don't understand options, like you can sell covered calls on a position, which people will say, well, is mildly bearish because you're basically capping. I don't believe that. I use options as a way to juice my returns on an underlying position, and I had an extra 20% return. So just to credentialize, so you're all like, oh, it's easy for you. I consistently outperformed the S&P with my portfolio. Last year, I had over a 70% return, and the S&P was up 22%. This year, we're in January. We're in the third week. S&P is up around 2%, and I'm up 3.5% through active management. And one more philosophical point: the reason why this is so important, if you hire a money manager, right, no matter how big your portfolio is, there's an opportunity cost for them caring too much about your money. They are not there, and they're not going to stare at your portfolio every day and be like, should we make this move? Should we sell covered calls today? Because it's not worth it. You're like a pain in the ass. So, but when it comes to your money, if you actively manage your money and you don't just throw it in an index and you don't just give it to Bob to collect his fee on your money, that vast interstitial space between a money manager and an index fund, there's a tremendous way to unlock value, and only you will care enough to do it. And so I manage my money every single day, at least 5 times a day, looking at what to do, calling the bank, moving this around, and that's how I outperform, because I care more than someone else would.
Yeah. Now that I really think about it, my biggest positions tend to outperform my small ones.
Right. Right. But
It's because of my conviction level.
well, of course, and also just using cover calls for those who understand it out there. Like, your money manager is not going to be like, hey, I think it's an opportunity to sell. So there's a lot of volatility in the market. We can get paid for premium. Let's sell some covered calls against Amazon. And by the way, if the stock runs, we'll just roll. We'll just roll out. If anybody who knows exactly what I'm saying right now, nobody's going to bother making that phone call to you because they're not going to get commission on it. But you could make $5,000 on that decision, or $2,000, and it matters to you. So anyway, I could go on and on, but I love this topic and I like being contrarian about it. So
Yeah, no, I know we don't have you for too much longer, so I do want to get to the book.
yeah,
So let's talk about your book. It's called Burn the Boats, and the general thesis of the book is that backup plans are overrated. It's not a great idea to rely on safety nets and things like that. So can you kind of give us kind of a quick summary on why you think safety nets aren't a great tool for people who want
yeah.
to go into business or anything like that?
Yeah, and again, this is not an argument against prudence. It's an argument that we wrongly define what prudent is. And so, from the beginning of time, every single culture on Earth pretty much has a fabled general who, when their backer was against the wall and they were going to get killed, and they were outnumbered 10-1, they always resort to the same strategy, and that's self-sabotage of retreat. It's amazing. They either burned the boats, they sunk the boats, they blew up the bridge, or they broke the cooking pots, all the way back to the beginning of time. And I was fascinated by, why is it that military leaders, when the stakes are the highest, follow the opposite advice that us parents give our kids? We tell them, oh, that's dangerous that you want to be the next Taylor Swift. Why don't you become an accountant instead? We erode belief by going ahead and creating backup plans. So I decided to write a book. What causes us to hesitate and retreat from our conviction? What are the metaphorical boats that try to make us withdraw? And they tend to fall into buckets all around psychology: imposter syndrome, shame, anxiety, trauma that's unresolved. I wanted to categorize all of them, and I wanted to challenge the idea that backup plans are prudent. And the science backs me up. There's a great study from 2014 that showed, like, they give two groups of students. One group, they said, you can think about another way to achieve this result if you would just think about it. And what they found, just by planting the seed of capitulation, the group that was allowed to contemplate plan B, one, performed materially worse than the other group, but two, when they measured their motivation, they just didn't care as much anymore. So why is that? Ask anyone who's ever done anything really improbable in life, including like Elon Musk, all the way down to the person you admire who opened up the candy store with no money, you know what I mean? And came from dirt, like I did. They will tell you there was a moment when they decided, I'm all in, I have burned the boats, and I'm fully committed, come what may. And the reason why that's so important is energy leakage. When you are trying to do something really, really hard, you need 110% of your energy. The mere energy that's being devoted to looking over your shoulder for backup plans is the very thing that causes you to need one. And so the premise of my book is the reason why people actually create backup plans is to ameliorate the pain of wanting something so bad. We all know what I'm talking about. When you want something so bad, the idea that you might not get it is like crushing. And you soothe yourself being like, maybe I'll go do this. And so I have a simple 4-step way of handling risk. And I'll share with you really quick. I call it my risk matrix. It's simple 4 steps. Number 1, I embrace my inner catastrophizer, who's very creative, and say, like, what's the worst that's going to happen if this doesn't work out? Number 2, I say, okay, if it doesn't work out, what would I do? Like, what is my plan B? And the reason why that question is so important, and everybody listening to this is nodding right now, you already know what your plan B in life is. It's right now, it's on my wall. It's this fancy piece of wallpaper called the law degree. The last thing I want to do is be a lawyer. But if I had to, it's right there. We have hardwired into our factory settings the ability to survive. Number 3, what's the probability that the worst thing is going to happen? Why that's so important is we are very bad anticipating the things that are going to go wrong, and we imagine things that never really materialize. And so you need to confront the absurdity of your own inner catastrophizer. And then number 4, the most important part of the process is like, what would I do? What would I endure? What pain would I subject myself to achieve my wildest dreams? And for me, when I have audacious goals, the answer is I would walk on glass to achieve what I want. And I argue that because people don't go through this 4-step process before they undertake a big goal, they have left unlitigated this idea of like this anxiety of what might happen if it doesn't work out. When you follow this process and you actually write it down, once you're pursuing things, you're like, what? I'm all in. I don't care. When those doubts creep into your mind, you're like, asked and answered. I know what my backup plan is in life, and I don't need to think about it. And for any parents out there, like, when your kid comes to you and tells you they have a big dream and you try to instill in them the idea that they need a backup plan, you're really telling them that you're afraid for them. It's out of love, but you're telling them that you don't believe or that the world is not safe. And so I tried to write a book for the anxiety-ridden, the angst-laden, the people for whom risk doesn't come naturally, and sort of flip their relationship with risk, because as you'll find in my book, I share a lot of cringy details about my battle with imposter syndrome and anxiety, because I wanted to show that most big, outrageous success happens in spite of the baggage we carry, not because of our assets. And for me, it's 100% in spite of. I went from being a high school dropout, with a GED, all the way to becoming a lawyer and on the set of Shark Tank. And you can too.
Well, I think we should leave it there. Matt, thanks so much for joining me. I know a lot of people are looking forward to reading the book now, so thanks again.
All right, thanks for having me. Have a good day, everybody.
Once again, thank you so much for joining me. Be sure to click subscribe if you don't subscribe to my channel already. And as always, this video is sponsored by The Motley Fool. Be sure to visit www.fool.com/Frankel to receive the top 10 best stocks to buy now.